As a quick notice before the video begins, this is the first of a two-part piece. I have a ton to say about the modern American university system, and I believe that to accurately discuss what problems I have with the way it works and why it works that way, I should first discuss the history behind the system itself. Part 2 will be out next week, week 3 of the 92 Days Project. All right, let me get to it now. Throughout human history, even back to the beginnings of civilization, we're given great evidence for the correlation between education and prosperity, not only on a personal level, but socially, culturally, and nationally. As civilizations were formed and the largely hunter-gatherer communities throughout Neolithic Mesopotamia, the Indus River Valley, the Nile River Valley, the Yellow River Valley, and many more like it, began to settle down, and as farming became the primary form of agricultural sustenance for these communities, we see that cities, cultures, social structures, and eventually nations would be formed. As we can see, each and every one of these adolescent societies would form their own hierarchies, with the most common feature across all of them being that with greater education comes greater power. For instance, the caste system that has been prevalent throughout the vast majority of the history of Southeast Asia, more specifically India, prizes education above all else, with the most educated individuals being given the greatest amount of influence and power. If we look at Egyptian social hierarchy, which we can find many variations on, we see the most common structure being the head of state, and below them his or her government officials, then the military, then scribes, and generally the literate, then merchants, craftsmen, and finally the peasantry, made up largely of farmers and slaves. In other words, the uneducated. With degrees of variation, we can see Mesopotamia and the Yellow River Valley holding similar structures, with the most significant changes being seen in what would become ancient China. This would end up being one of the most tenacious and long-lived ideas about the world. And while the methods of education and the groups who educate may have changed over time, the social importance has never waned. As we make our way through history and up to the American colonial era, we continue to see the most influential and powerful among the colonies being government officials, religious hierarchy, and landed gentry, all of which were highly educated individuals, even if it were in more or less specific professions. Between 1636 and 1776, there had been 9 chartered colleges throughout the colonies, known today as the Colonial Colleges, which, according to John Thielen, were staffed almost entirely by tutors and instructors rather than by an equivalent representation of a degreed professor. As such, it was very common for the highly educated in the colonies to have received the majority of their education back in Europe. Adjacently, it was common practice for the many Protestant denominations as well as Catholic dioceses of a region to set up religious colleges that would provide a higher education focused around a Christian worldview. What we know as Princeton today would have been called the College of New Jersey upon its founding in 1746 by the New Light Presbyterians, alongside the Church of England opening King's College in New York City. During the American Revolution, King's College would overthrow its Tory, or British Loyalist, administration, naming it Columbia in 1784. Rhode Island College, known today as Brown University, was founded by Baptists in 1764, being the most liberal in the classical sense, in that they were very open and welcoming of admitting other denominations into their classes. As early as the end of the Revolution, President George Washington, alongside a great number of the Founding Fathers, were great advocates for the creation of a national college. Not out of a need to compete with European nations, as the existence of a national college was not very widespread, but rather in an attempt to further unify the new nation in a spirit of republicanism, and to promote an increased level of education and ensure the constant improvement of a nation's intellectual and scholarly pursuits with those across the Atlantic. Regardless of intentions, the idea faced too strong of opposition from the many individualists who distrusted the uniformity of ideas, believing that the conformity of education necessarily promotes a diminishing of free thought. While the idea never came to fruition, the many smaller-scale projects beginning with similar aims created many of today's most respected scholarly and intellectual institutions, such as the Smithsonian Institute, National Observatory, and the National Academy of Sciences. Despite all attempts, the modern university system would have to wait for another individual during a far more tumultuous time in the nation's history. In 1857, the Morrill Act would be proposed to Congress in an attempt to establish a series of state colleges throughout the country in order to bring higher education to the more rural landscape of the Midwest and towards the Pacific. Though Congress passed the legislation, it had been vetoed by then-President James Buchanan, and in 1861 it would be resubmitted with the amendments that these colleges would also offer military, engineering, and agricultural education. Aided by the secession of most of the states who disagreed with the bill, thus reconfiguring the Congress, the Morrill Land Grant Act would be signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln on July 2nd of 1862. From this bill, the creation of the state college system would be born, and while the option to qualify as a land-grant college was put forth and accepted by several locations, the first state college created under the Morrill Land Grant Act would be Kansas State University. Founded on February 16th of 1863 and opening on September 2nd of the same year, Kansas State University was one of the first of a series of land-grant colleges that would eventually cover all 50 states and total in more than 17 million acres worth of land. That would be approximately $7.5 million, which, adjusted for inflation and before we talk about institutional cost, that's over $200 million. By all accounts, the future of education was American education. It transformed the landscape of engineering education and boosted the country to a place of academic leadership across the globe, where universities previously focused on the classical Renaissance style of education, where an individual focuses on the study of great philosophers and the development of many different skills for a more all-encompassing benefit. The land-grant colleges, and eventually the majority of the system, would focus their efforts on what the bill called mechanic arts, and that what we might call applied sciences and engineering. Interestingly enough, the land-grant money was specifically stated in the bill not to be used for any overly expensive or opulent buildings. Off me, I guess. With the end of the Civil War came Reconstruction, and alongside it was the Second Morrill Act of 1890, wherein there was a requirement that race was not an admissions criteria, or else that there was designation for a separate land-grant institution for such. With this came many of the historically black colleges and universities, such as the Tuskegee Institute and the Booker T. Washington Institute. For almost 160 years to follow, American universities have been repeatedly recognized as some of, if not the best universities in the world. In large part, this is due to the advanced curriculum, which promoted upward mobility, trained strong community leadership, and encouraged philanthropic ventures posed by the alumni. However, one of the greatest strengths of the system was its large focus on graduate programs. As more individuals were capable of attaining higher education, there was an increase in the number of people who would travel to Europe from the US, more specifically to Germany, in order to obtain a doctorate of philosophy in one of the denominations, usually under the sciences or humanities. With that came an increase in the demand for graduate programs, and thus many graduate schools were born across the United States. Whereas before the mid-19th century, prestigious schools like Harvard and Yale would award only a handful, by which I mean less than 10, graduate degrees per year. These new graduate schools were gateways for graduate level education on a domestic scale. By the 20th century, junior colleges, also known as community colleges, would come into fashion as these city-funded, low-cost schools would provide education for the growing white-collar labor force in urban environments across the country. In fact, while I was in high school, I had also attended a local community college as part of my curriculum. It was designated as an early college academy, which aimed to provide the equivalent of a 2-year associate's degree by the time I graduated from high school. And believe me, this is not going to be the last time you hear of it. With the end of World War II came resettlement and re-entering the normal world. In an effort to avoid the crisis with the World War I veterans receiving pay, Congress would pass the GI Bill in 1944 to provide a pathway towards higher education for veterans of all economic backgrounds, as well as loans for purchasing a home for themselves and their families. It made college education possible by either paying full tuition and living expenses for veterans, or paying anywhere from 50 to 80% through subsidies, helping these recently returned to be able to fund a life outside of college. At this point, veterans were around 10% more likely to graduate from college than non-veterans, and most campuses became overwhelmingly male due to the near-complete majority of the military being entirely male. In 1964, Congress would pass many of President Johnson's Great Society programs, which greatly expanded the federal support for education. For instance, the Higher Education Act of 1965 created the federal scholarships and low-interest loans for college students while simultaneously subsidizing better academic libraries, approximately 20 new graduate schools, many technical institutions, and much more. Now, as a last note for this week's video, the creation of for-profit universities in the late 20th century is a contentious issue often brought up when discussing the merits of free higher education. First, I'd like to say we can dive further into my own thoughts on the subject at some point down the line, most likely in next week's video. But as of now, I will only go over the factual information about the actual existence and the governmental resistance towards these institutions. These institutions were, and still can be, very appealing to low-income students who can borrow money for attendance, as well as veterans who receive their tuition through the above GI Bill. The controversies mostly revolve around the students either not graduating these institutions or graduating without the ability to find relevant work. Many of the aforementioned students will default on their loans as a result. There's a very vocal crowd that sees these institutions as fundamentally changing the public view of higher education away from being seen as a common good. Some of these institutions have been sanctioned by federal authorities for their predatory behavior in regards to loans and tuition, especially when the degree is seen to have a lower value than the same one from a public institution. And that's pretty much everything you need to know in a broad sense for next week's video. This is likely to be a shorter video than I would usually want to put out, as I do enjoy detailed information myself. The reason being is that I need the extra time to be able to plot out my talking points and gather my evidence for next week's video. I have a lot of mixed ideas that I need to iron out, and I believe that without the extra time, I will fail to be able to properly position my argument and would misrepresent many aspects of both the side I'm arguing for and against. Thank you for understanding, have a good one, and I'll see you next time.